Before I ask you the first question, I did want to explain to you why we're doing this a little bit differently. I'm a comedian, I'm an idiot, I don't know anything about I don't have an Israeli doctorate, I don't understand Palestinian issues, but that was on purpose. Because what I realized was it's a very volatile issue. It's something that people are very passionate about. So I thought to myself, all right, if I was to ask a Palestinian, here's what Israel accuses you of, let them answer. In other words, if I was asked Israeli, here's what you're accused of by Palestinians, let them answer. And then weigh the evidence and see if we can validate what is said from an objective point of view. Perhaps we can at least come to a conclusion that seems to be logical and reasonable and allow us to get out of the passions that sometimes blind us to truth.
Sure, and let the viewer decide.
That's
after
exactly
hearing the facts on all the sides.
That's exactly was the premise of the whole thing. So,
Good.
That being said, I wanted to start with your expertise, which is law, because we have a lot of people who have rabbis who have historical knowledge and certainly rabbinical and Judeo traditional knowledge as far as precedents for the land and so forth along that line. But one of the things that constantly have been mentioned was international law is used, and maybe you can clarify this for me, because again, I'm coming in as an idiot, but supposedly a number of countries have signed on to say and agree that they have breached international law as far as an occupying nation, so on and so forth. Well, I felt like as a lawyer that would be something we need to clear up. If Israel has in fact broken an international law, that needs to be addressed. If they haven't, we need to know. But there should be a concise answer to that. I'm hoping you can help me and give me that.
Israel's occupation is completely lawful. Any country is entitled to occupy an enemy country that is using its boundaries to attack. Take, for example, the Golan Heights. Israel captured the Golan Heights in a defensive war against Syria. It would be absurd for Israel to give the Golan Heights back to who? To Assad? To ISIS? And it would be used as a battleship from which to launch rocket attacks. Israel was perfectly entitled to maintain its occupation in the Gaza Strip. Look what happened when it ended its occupation. Thousands and thousands of rockets. An occupation under international law can continue until all belligerency ends. And nobody can look you in the eye and say that Palestinian belligerency against the nation state of the Jewish people has ended. Now, you want to talk about occupations that are unjust, let's talk about China's occupation of Tibet. Let's talk about Russia's occupation of Königsberg. Let's talk about the Turkish occupations. Let's talk about the dozens and dozens of other occupations that the BDS movement ignores.
So would you say that it's easy to find, and the equivalents, as you just mentioned, it's easy to document everything you just said, and that they are equivalent, that the same scenarios took place that allowed Israel to have access to its borders and the places that it's conquered compared to the things you just mentioned, so that it's irrefutable. If you don't want to deal with the evidence, so be it.
It's not comparable. Israel's claim for a continued military occupation of the Gaza, the Golan, and the West Bank is far superior in international law than any other current occupations. Now, we have to distinguish between the military occupation on the one hand and the building of civilian settlements on the other hand. The building of civilian settlements does raise some questions, and it raises questions, is this an occupation? If it's not an occupation, then the rules governing the civilian settlements don't apply. If it is an occupation, then there are some questions involved in civilian settlement. Those same questions exist in Tibet, where China has built dozens and dozens, hundreds and hundreds of civilian settlements. The same thing is true in Königsberg, where Russia expelled the entire German population and had complete ethnic cleansing and had its own civilians settle the entire city. So what we're talking about here is the BDS movement. What does that stand for? Bigoted double standard. That's what BDS is all about. It's bigoted because it focuses only on the nation state of the Jewish people, and it applies a double standard to the nation state of the Jewish people.
You know, again, maybe I'm being redundant on some of this, but it's just to get on record, especially again as a law professor. So when they're accused of occupation, you just mentioned why you feel that's not necessarily accurate. Also, though, as we look at the voting that the United Nations puts into place when it comes every year, and again, I'm coming in ignorant, so I'm not pretending to be an expert as you would be. There's votes that they go annually against Israel that is never given to any other country. Can you go into that a little bit and what obviously seems a little bit unfair, or I mean, there's something else going on here that makes no sense.
The General Assembly of the United Nations has issued more declarations against Israel than all the rest of the nations in the world combined. As Abi Ibn put it, literally, almost 50 years ago, if Algeria introduced a resolution at the General Assembly that the earth is flat and that Israel flattened it, it would win 126 to 48 with 23 abstentions. We know exactly who would vote for it and who would vote against it. It's a knee-jerk annual parade of hate directed against the nation state of the Jewish people, and only the nation state of the Jewish people. Let's go back to one particular year in history, 1975. In that year, millions of Cambodians were being murdered by Pol Pot. It was one of the worst genocides since the end of the Second World War. Not a single resolution condemning Pol Pot or the Cambodian genocide, and the UN spent its year having a resolution comparing Israel and Zionism to racism. Or take modern times when Syria is falling apart. Hundreds of thousands of people are being killed, millions displaced. Hard to find any resolutions condemning Assad, condemning ISIS, but you find resolutions repeatedly condemning Israel. Every time Israel adds a bathroom to a house in a settlement on the West Bank, it gets condemned. No matter how many barrel bombs Assad drops, very hard to find real condemnation.
The biggest elements that I've seen when I was in Israel myself, talking to Palestinians, whether they are representatives or they're just citizens, and vice versa with the Israeli side, they're all passionate, they all have the same evidence, but they seem to be interpreting it differently. And that's where I thought your expertise comes in, because there has to be some objective standard that we can look at and say, here's the truth. You don't have to live by it. I can't do that.
Okay.
But there has to be a way to look to have an objective. Right. Okay, so that being said, when these things, you answered the occupied scenario, you also showed where other countries seem to be doing similar things and not being held accountable. Apartheid, that was brought up all the time. This is an apartheid state. We have checkpoints. We can't come through here. We don't have access to the same things that Israel is. Should be, and of course the BDS movement seemed to be effective in South Africa, so they're trying to make an equivalency there. Can you talk to the apartheid state?
There is absolutely no analogy between Israel and apartheid South Africa. In apartheid South Africa, a small number of whites dominated the country. Blacks couldn't vote, had no access to the judiciary, were selectively executed. Whereas in Israel, Arabs vote, they serve on the Supreme Court, they serve on universities. Yes, there is an occupation, a military occupation. And if you want to see what it looks like to end the occupation, look at Gaza. And Gaza, the occupation ends, and thousands of rockets and terror tunnels are built from Gaza to kill Israelis. International law does not require a country to commit suicide. It doesn't require a country to give up an occupation as long as there is a belligerency.
Now, who defines belligerency? Because obviously the Palestinians believe that Israel starts the rockets. They're the ones that start the aggression. I mean, so how do we validate the truth so that people can make an objective opinion?
There's very objective analysis. When Israel ended its occupation of the Gaza, for the next year, there were no Israeli constraints. Gaza could have become the Singapore of the Mediterranean, and then Hamas took over, and the rocket attacks began. There's no disputing those facts. Israel then responds. This is not a cycle of violence. This is violence started on one side and responded to on the other. It would be like calling ISIS's attack in Paris a cycle of violence, because the police then shot and killed the ISIS attackers. But we know that ISIS started the attack. So the notion of apartheid is absurd. The leaders of the anti-apartheid movement in America, congressmen, senators, I was part of that movement, Professor Irwin Cotler was part of that movement. None of us believes that what's going on in Israel is apartheid. First of all, even the strongest supporters of the apartheid analogy don't say that Israel proper is subject to apartheid. They say that the occupation makes it into apartheid. Well, every occupation, every lawful military occupation has a double standard. Obviously, you don't apply the same rules to your enemies as you do to your citizens. When the United States occupied Germany, the Germans didn't vote in American elections. The Japanese didn't vote in American elections. We were occupying them. Once belligerency ended, the occupation ended. Once belligerency ends on the Palestinian side, the occupation will end. Israel ended its occupation of Gaza much too early.
This might sound like an odd question, but I think it was something that continued to befuddle me. Was that in many cases, some of the most stringent anti-Israeli groups or individuals are Jewish. Now, that is something that is very difficult for me to wrap my mind around. I'm going to assume that you would claim to be more of a liberal worldview.
I am a liberal Democrat.
All right.
I support Israel because I'm a liberal. Look, throughout history, Jews have supported their enemies. Jews voted for Mussolini. Hannah Arendt had an affair with Martin Heidegger and then justified his Nazism after the Second World War. There have always been self-hating Jews throughout history. And I think Jews who apply a double standard to Israel are part of an old process of having to work out your own concerns about your Judaism through political opposition to Israel.
So specifically, the college campuses, I know in Europe it seems to be a new wave of anti-Semitism. It's very frightening. People are wanting, Jews are wanting to leave Paris, France. They're saying it's unlivable now. One would think after 50 years in the Holocaust that this would never happen. It's this quickly it's happening.
Okay,
BDS, suddenly on college campuses in America.
Many of the Jewish supporters of the BDS movement against Israel hate America. They hate America. They hate Western values. They're hard leftists. Nothing Western is good. They hark back to old tropes of colonialism and that kind of 19th century history. And you scratch an anti-Israel person deep enough, and you'll find an anti-American, anti-Western. You scratch some of them deep enough, and you will find anti-Semitism. Not all, but you'll find it among some. It is irrational to single out Israel for the kind of BDS or opprobrium that is now directed against it. There is no rational basis for singling out Israel. And so you have to ask yourself, why are so many people acting irrationally? And that's a question more for psychiatrists than for political analysts.
Okay. When I spoke to many Palestinians, they have a history, oral history, of where they were displaced, where they were moved from their homes. Those homes were either demolished or were taken over, so on and so forth. Wouldn't that give them some sort of case? We lived here. This is our land. Here's our home. It's gone. How can you justify that? How does one do that?
Why were Palestinians displaced in 1948 and 1949? Because Israel accepted the two-state solution that was suggested by the United Nations, and the Palestinians and all the surrounding Arab countries rejected it. And so on the day that Israel declared its independence as the nation-state of the Jewish people, they were attacked by every one of the Arab nations and the Palestinians. In the process, there was an exchange of population. 700,000 or so Palestinians were displaced from their homes where they had lived for dozens of years, some maybe hundreds of years, certainly not as long as the Jews had lived in Arab and Muslim countries. 700,000 Jews who lived in Arab and Muslim countries had lived there for 3,000 years, and the same number were displaced. So we have an exchange of population. What happened is that Israel welcomed the 700,000 Jews who had been displaced by Arab and Muslim countries, whereas the Arab states refused to welcome the Palestinian refugees, put them in camps, and kept them as a festering sore against Israel. So there is no moral claim today that Palestinians have a right to return to their homes. The people they should blame for having lost their homes are the Arab states and the Palestinian leaders who attacked Israel.
Yeah, and a lot of people blame, and even Palestinians will blame their leadership. It always kind of goes back there. A lot of these citizens want peace. And then we ask this question, maybe it's unanswerable. Is peace possible there? Is a two-state solution feasible?
The two-state solution is not only feasible, it's necessary and inevitable. There's no alternative that will work. Now, how you define the two states, whether Palestine is a disarmed state, whether there are Israeli security, borders, those will all have to be negotiated. Whether Gaza is part of any two-state solution, or do you need a three-state solution, whether or not there'll be association between a Palestinian state and Jordan, all of these are subject to negotiation, but ultimately a two-state solution is the only just answer, both for Israel and for the Palestinians.
And do you have some inkling of what kind of a boundary that would have to be feasible without going immediately back into a war, or at least being attacked?
Well, I know what boundaries it can't be. It can't be the 67 lines. The 67 lines exposed Israel to attack, rocket attack. It would require the closing of the Ben Gurion airport. It would mean that the Western Wall was part of Palestine, not part of Israel, the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem. All these have to be subject to land swaps, negotiated solutions. The problem, Palestinians won't sit down and negotiate. The Israelis have offered to negotiate with no preconditions. Why won't the Palestinians sit down and negotiate? Because of the BDS movement. Because they think they're winning on university campuses. They think they're winning in the court of public opinion. They think they're winning in Europe. And they fool themselves into thinking they'll get a Palestinian state without having to make the difficult compromises that statehood will require them to make.
Obviously, your reputation is well known. When you spoke about being a liberal, I would say that much of the BDS movement probably stems from liberal progressive thought, because they want to be fair-minded to people. They want to you give everybody equal access and so forth. And yet, it seems to be leading to more tyranny, more censorship, and not allowing real freedom of speech on campuses. So if you were speaking to your own ideologues or philosophically liberal folks, what would you tell them they're missing when it comes to defending Israel?
The BDS movement is not a liberal or progressive movement. It's a radical movement. Liberals generally don't support singling out Israel for condemnation and sanctions. When I debate the BDS movement, I make the liberal case against BDS. I make the argument BDS is bad for peace. BDS is bad for morality. BDS is bad for the single standard. BDS violates all the progressive and liberal values that we stand for. BDS is collective punishment. It hurts people who do not support the Israeli government. It would be like having a boycott and divest movement against every Catholic in the world because we don't approve of the Catholic Church's position on a woman's right to choose abortion or on gay marriage. But nobody would support a BDS movement against the Catholic Church or against all Catholics. Many don't support those positions. Many Israelis don't support settlement policies in Israel. So the BDS movement is immoral and illiberal. When I try to speak on college campuses against the BDS movement or in favor of Israel, there are often violent reactions. People want to keep me from speaking on the campus. Sometimes it takes the form of trying to shout me down. Sometimes it takes the form of petitions. At Johns Hopkins, students painted a Hitler mustache on a poster advertising my talk on my face. Sometimes what is being done is illegal. For example, you can't stop a speaker from speaking, even though Justice for Palestine students often try to do that. You can protest speakers on campus. So there's a balance that has to be struck between legitimate protest and trying to stop free speech on campus. And no university should tolerate students or outsiders who are trying to stop pro-Israel speakers from speaking on campus. Students who are supportive of Israel have a legal right to safety and security of their physical being. The police must be there to protect them. And violent demonstrations are not protected by the Constitution. Incitements to violence are not protected by the Constitution. It's a hard line to draw, but often we know it when we see it. If there's an attempt to prevent free speech, that shouldn't be defended. If there's an attempt to promote free speech, that should be defended.
Well, and you would again know, with your expertise, that the freedom given to us in the First Amendment does not give you the freedom to destroy the First Amendment. So where is the boundary when it's gone off into no longer protected speech? What would that be?
The First Amendment gives you the right to complain about the First Amendment. It gives you the right to call for a constitutional amendment to abrogate the First Amendment, by the way, which many people on college campuses would agree to today. Polls show that a very substantial percentage of young students on campuses today don't respect the First Amendment and don't believe in free speech. And they have a right to try to get the First Amendment abolished, but they have no right to use violence to stop people from exercising their First Amendment rights.
And that's legal.
It's legal to try to undo the First Amendment.
Wow.
Right.
I didn't know that.
First Amendment protects people who want to abolish the First Amendment.
I didn't know that.
It also protects people who want to abolish the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. If you want to call for a return to slavery in the United States, you have a right to do that. You just can't implement it.
Right, but I mean, there is some kind of laws about not allowing people to come in and undermine the government or trying to actually overthrow that.
No, you can. First Amendment permits you to try to undermine the government through speech, through elections, but not through violence.
So, as a comedian, a Gentile in the United States, walking around just exploring this issue, why should I care about Israel? Why should I care what happens to Israel? It's not affecting me, or is it?
You should care about Israel because Israel is America's only reliable ally in the Middle East. Israel has always been the canary in the mine. What happens to Israel ultimately spreads. Terrorism started against Israel. Now it's all over Europe and coming to the United States. And so you have to care about Israel because if you don't care about Israel, what's happening in Israel is coming to a theater near you.
Well, there were 2 terrorist attacks while we were there, and I was only there for a week. It was interesting. They commented on the San Bernardino attack. We had some security with us, and they said, "Oh, you're just figuring out you have terrorists, 24/7 in Israel for 60-some years." So they've had to learn to deal with it, and it's interesting that they're not traumatized by it.
Well, terrorism in Israel goes way, way beyond the occupation. There was terrorism in Israel in 1929. There was terrorism in Israel in the 1930s. There was terrorism in Israel between 1948 and 1967. The PLO was established before any occupation or any civilian settlements. So to argue that the settlements or the occupation caused terrorism is to get the facts backwards. It's terrorism that causes the continuation of the occupation.
Now, one of the areas that you did say was possibly there would be something to discuss was like you said, the West Bank and the settling there and so forth. So how should that play out ultimately to make that make sense and be fair if you feel they went there illegally in the first place?
I have been opposed to Israel's settlement policy since 1973. I signed my first petition against a civilian Israeli settlement back in 1973. But I'm also opposed to many of my own country's policies. I'm opposed to many of France's and Britain's and Russia's policies. But just because you're opposed to a particular policy of a particular country doesn't mean you apply economic death penalty against it. The BDS movement is intended to be an economic death penalty. You have to look at the whole country, and Israel's human rights record is superb compared to other countries. I challenge any of your viewers to name a single country in the history of the world faced with threats comparable to those faced by Israel that has ever had a better record of human rights, a higher compliance with the rule of law, and more concern to protect the lives of civilians. You cannot name a single country because there is none. And to single out the best and condemn it as the worst tells us more about those doing the condemning than it does about those who are being condemned.
Let's go back to the United Nations. Because of how you show the disparity in the way that they vote and the obvious bias against Israel, is there an agenda there? Is there something that you can enlighten us as to why this is happening and who's driving this BDS movement after all?
The BDS movement is driven by people who are opposed to the existence of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. The head of the BDS movement has said that he does not support the two-state solution. He supports a one-state solution, and that one state would be a Muslim state, Palestine, which would become a haven for ISIS and other terrorist groups. So let nobody confuse the BDS movement with simply an anti-occupation or anti-settlement movement. Its goal is to destroy the nation state of the Jewish people. And indeed, the reason that it's hard to get a debate about BDS is I was supposed to have a debate at the Oxford Union with the head of the BDS movement. He refused to debate me because I'm subject to the BDS movement. As a supporter of Israel, he won't debate me. He is boycotting me. Then they scheduled another speaker. She also backed out because I am subject to the boycott divestment movement. There's another reason you can't have a debate. I challenged Stephen Hawking, who supports the BDS movement, to debate me. He can't accept the debate because the machine that he uses to talk with was manufactured in Israel. So he can't have a debate about BDS, supporting BDS, while using techniques that were developed in Israel. If people really want to support the BDS movement, they have to give up their cell phones. They have to give up drip agriculture. They have to give up many of the pharmaceuticals that save lives. I take every day pharmaceuticals that are manufactured and developed in Israel. So in addition to being a double standard and bigoted, the BDS movement is hypocritical. Nobody is going to boycott Israeli products that help them and make their lives better. Same students who are pushing the BDS movement on college campuses are also pushing the safe space movement.
Yes.
We don't want anybody to say anything that offends us. We want mommy and daddy Dean to protect us from dangerous ideas. We want people to be subject to racial sensitivity programs like in Mao's China if they espouse free speech or hold up a sign that talks about the willingness of everybody to have a place in the marketplace of ideas. So what we're seeing is a radicalization on college campuses, which includes an attack on free speech, an attack on Western values, and an attack on Israel.
Again, without trying to make it too personable, but I think some of the people that are watching this would be Jewish people who are not necessarily supporters. Is there any way that you could specifically reach out to those people with some sort of sense of explaining where they're missing it, just so that perhaps they can learn from that? Yeah.
All I ask for is nuance and understanding. Israel faces terrible decisions, terrible crises. Were I the leader of Israel, I might make some very, very different decisions. Were I the leader of the United States, I would make very different decisions. But Israel's the only country in the world where if you disagree with its policies, people call for its abolition as the nation state of the Jewish people, or people call for boycott, divestment, and sanction movements against it. It's the only country in the world where disagreement over policy results in a call for economic capital punishment. So criticize Israel if you are critical of its policies, but don't overstate it and don't call for sanctions to be directed only against the nation state of the Jewish people. There is a name for that, and it's called bigotry.
Well, I'm very careful about use of words because I'm a comic and I think they're important because they carry so much weight. And I find that oftentimes the ideas of bigotry and racism are used not to give clarity, but to censor because they disagree with your point of view. So I want to be careful about not trying to assume, but I wonder if enough evidence is piling up to say that we're really dealing with a new or maybe continued form of anti-Semitism is what we're really dealing with. If Israel were not the nation state of the Jewish people, there would not be a BDS campaign against it. If you want to call that anti-Semitism, that's your choice. I would not use that term. But the fact that Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people is the most relevant factor in why the BDS movement has now traveled so widely around Europe particularly and among many on the hard left. The most important thing is to bring people to Israel. When I bring students to Israel, the first place I take them to is not the Western Wall, not Jerusalem, not Tel Aviv. I take them to Ramallah. I take them to the capital of the Palestinian Authority, and they see a booming city without a single Israeli soldier or policeman. They see high-tech stores. They see BMWs. They see a beautiful building, a beautiful capital, and they see what a Palestinian state could look like if it only didn't stop seeking the end of the nation state of the Jewish people. When the Palestinian leadership and people want their own state, more than they want to see the end of the nation state of the Jewish people, there will be a two-state solution. How is it not possible for people to simply show the truth and instead of the propaganda, and sort of force people to have to deal with their obvious bias? Why does that not happen internationally?
It's a far better story for the media to show refugee camps and slums than to show beautiful buildings in Ramallah, beautiful buildings in Jericho, nice areas of Bethlehem. And so the media tends to focus on the refugee camps without mentioning that the only reason there are refugee camps is because the Palestinian leadership insists that they remain as festering sores to build up antagonism, to create terrorism. They could end these refugee camps in a minute. Complicitous in this in the United Nations. These are the only refugees who have been kept in camps for close to 70 years now. The time has come to end these refugee camps, to integrate Palestinians into the mainstream of the West Bank and other areas where they live outside of the Palestinian areas, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Jordan. The time has come to recognize that these folks are no longer refugees. They are political pawns being used by the Palestinian leadership and by opponents of Israel to maintain a festering sore and to maintain opposition to the nation state of the Jewish people. The statute of limitations on refugee status has long expired.
Is there some advantage for certain countries to support this BDS or the Palestinians' position? Is there some political advantages why they're doing this?
Let's remember who is a staunch opponent of the BDS movement, and that is President Abbas of the Palestinian Authority. He knows that the BDS movement will not help Palestine get a state. He knows that it's immoral and improper. And I wish other world leaders would see the light. Many do oppose the BDS movement, but some have now favored a modified BDS movement where you label products from the West Bank, but not label products from China's occupation of Tibet, not label products from other areas of Europe where there are occupations. That too applies a bigoted double standard.
Yes. When I would speak to Palestinians, one of the questions I asked a number of them was, is there anything Israel has done for you that you would say this was good? They could not bring themselves to say one thing.
Let me give you some answers to that. Israel has extended the life of Palestinians on the West Bank. They have a much higher life expectancy than Arabs in other parts of the world. They have much more freedom of expression, freedom to criticize than Arabs and Muslims in other parts of the world. They have better health. They have better education. I'm not here to justify the occupation or to argue that the occupation is a good thing. It would be better if it could end peaceably. But the idea that it's among the worst occupations is preposterous. And the objective evidence demonstrates that many benefits have accrued to the Palestinians, including political nationalism. Remember, the Palestinians never regarded themselves as a people in 1938. They went to the Peel Commission and said, we're not a people, we're part of southern Syria. The occupation helped to galvanize Palestinian political leaders. So it's been a mixed picture for Palestinians. I hope it ends, but it has to end with security to Israel.
So again, coming to you as an expert in law, is there any international law or anything whatsoever, I don't even know what type of law you would be referring to in this case, that is sort of disputable, that you could kind of say maybe there is a case for this?
Yes.
Or can you give me any example of that?
Right. There is no dispute about the fact that Israel is entitled to maintain a military occupation until belligerency ends. There is no dispute that it didn't have to end the occupation of Gaza while rockets were being attacked, were being fired at its civilians. There is dispute about the civilian settlements. I wish that what Israel had done in Gaza was to end the civilian settlements, but maintain some kind of military occupation that would have saved lots of lives. Palestinian lives and Israeli lives, because it wouldn't have permitted the rockets to be fired at Israeli civilians and require Israel to respond. So I think there's a very sharp distinction legally between a military occupation and civilian settlements.
And then I guess to be fair, can you think of any claims or grievances the Palestinians have that you as a lawyer would look and go, I could see that. I could defend that.
I can defend Palestinian claims for civilian settlements in areas that will not remain part of Israel after a settlement. Much of the civilian settlements in Israel are in areas that everybody acknowledges will remain part of Israel after a settlement and land swaps. But there are some that are outside of the security barrier. And I think there's a legitimate grievance about those settlements.
Well, then, I guess, lastly, because you certainly have answered much more eloquently than I've asked, I guess if you were to finish with sort of your last advocacy for your home nation, I'm thinking you would think, at least spiritually or in your heart, that people don't understand or need to really understand about what Israel represents to humanity, what would that be?
Israel represents a desire by the Jewish people to have a homeland of their own, having experienced horrible anti-Semitism in Europe, culminating in the Holocaust. Israel, which was founded well before the Holocaust, at least the areas of Israel that became part of Israel, became home to the Jewish people. And every people is entitled to a home. There is only one home the Jewish people have. There are multiple homes Muslims have, multiple homes Arabs have, multiple homes many other ethnicities and religions have. Judaism is a civilization, and a civilization is entitled to a homeland. The Jewish homeland happens to be in a very dangerous neighborhood. So Israel has been terrorized and battled against since its inception. And it's done a pretty good job. Could it have done a better job? Could it do more to achieve peace? Yeah, I think so. But judge Israel in context. Don't judge it as an abstraction, as a colonialist regime. I ask viewers to ask themselves, if you were the Prime Minister of Israel, surrounded by enemies, with rockets coming from Gaza, with ISIS on the border of the Golan, what would you do? What sacrifices would you make for peace? You might disagree with the current administration, but understand it's complex, it's difficult. The Prime Minister of Israel has as his or her responsibility preserving the nation state of the Jewish people and preserving the safety of the citizens of Israel. On balance, I think Israel deserves praise, not condemnation, for the way it's responded to these challenges over the past nearly 70 years.
And I guess one last quick thing, because I did see a lot of integration of Christians, Jews, Muslims working together happy.
Yeah.
But because this is so topical right now, I would throw in, do you feel like the surrounding Arab countries have a moral obligation to these refugees that seem to be heading into Europe and the United States? And what is causing them not to take in their own people, if that's what they mean, if that means so much to them?
The world has an obligation to rescue war refugees. We saw how the world failed that obligation during the Holocaust, when no country would take in Jewish refugees. So every country in the world has an obligation, but the obligation lies first and foremost with the Arab and Muslim nations of the area. Jordan has done a good job. Saudi Arabia has done nothing. Most of the other Arab and Muslim countries have done little or nothing, and they have the primary obligation. In the end, the United States is the default country. We are the country with the Statue of Liberty. We are the nation of immigrants, and we have to stand as a place of asylum for people who are made refugees by wars anywhere in the world.
Even though it potentially could bring in some criminals within the midst of them.
Life is always filled with risks, and the excuse that many countries made during the Holocaust was that if you bring in refugees from Europe, who knows, there might be some spies or some Nazis among them. That's not a justification or an excuse for refusing to save the lives of many, many innocent people.